What happens when a young girl dares to speak the truth, only to be laughed at by everyone around her? Stay with us to witness a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. The morning sun barely warmed the cracked sidewalks of Greenville, South Carolina, as 11-year-old Aaliyah Rivers stood outside the small brick duplex she and her mother had moved into only a week earlier. Her mother, Tasha, crouched in front of her, tying the last knot in Aaliyah's shoelaces for the third time. It wasn't about the laces, it was the quiet ritual of protection, of delaying the moment when her daughter would walk into a world that too often stared before it smiled. Aaliyah adjusted the straps on her backpack and shifted her weight from foot to foot as she tried to look confident. Tasha looked up at her, her voice soft and unwavering. "You're smart, you're kind, and you belong." Aaliyah nodded, but her chest felt heavy with the familiar churn of being the new kid. This was their third move in 2 years, and each time it got harder to believe that fitting in was even possible. The first day they arrived in Greenville, an elderly white man stopped mowing his lawn to watch them unload their car, his gaze not angry, just unreadable. A woman walking her dog crossed the street without a word. It wasn't outright hostility, but something colder, something that said, "We see you and we're watching." The school bus groaned to a stop at the corner. As Aaliyah climbed aboard, the usual chatter of middle schoolers dropped a few decibels. Heads turned just enough to glance at her, then turned back just as quickly. No one said anything. No one moved over. She walked down the narrow aisle and found a seat at the back next to the window where no one would have to share space. She hugged her backpack like a shield and stared outside the window, counting telephone poles until they reached Brookside Middle School. The building looked clean and welcoming on the surface, with tidy flower beds and banners that read things like character counts and choose kindness. But as Aaliyah stepped through the glass doors, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was in the way the students clustered in familiar circles glanced at her, then looked away. It was in the way teachers nodded politely, but didn't smile. In the way she already knew where not to stand. Room 208 was on the second floor near the end of the hall. Aaliyah walked past lockers that had been decorated with colorful tape and glittery stickers and stepped into her homeroom. Mrs. Bishop was at the front of the class writing on the whiteboard. She was in her late 50s with sharp cheekbones and gray-streaked hair styled in a bob that curled neatly under her ears. Her reading glasses sat low on her nose as she scribbled the day's objective in tidy cursive. When Aaliyah entered, Mrs. Bishop turned her head slightly. "Class, we have a new student," she said without full acknowledgement. "This is Aaliyah from Atlanta." Aaliyah corrected her softly. It's pronounced Aaliyah, but the teacher had already turned back to the board. "Find a seat, please." "Madison, make room." A blonde girl by the window reluctantly shoved her backpack a few inches to the side. Aaliyah sat down quietly, placing her hands on the desk and fixing her gaze forward. The morning passed in fragments. A reading comprehension worksheet, a vocabulary game, a discussion about grammar. Aaliyah raised her hand a few times. She knew the answers, she always did. But Mrs. Bishop never called on her. Not once. When Madison offered a hesitant answer, Mrs. Bishop beamed and said, "Good effort, you're close." But when Aaliyah got a full answer correct during group work, the teacher gave a short nod and moved on without acknowledgement. By the time lunch rolled around, Aaliyah already felt the lines that had been drawn in invisible ink. The cafeteria was a hum of laughter and clicks. Aaliyah walked slowly with her tray looking for a seat. She spotted one at the edge of a table, but as she moved closer, two kids slid their trays toward the empty spot and shook their heads without speaking. Another table suddenly had jackets on every chair. She wandered to the farthest corner and sat alone, picking at her sandwich without appetite. She heard her name once in the din, followed by stifled giggles. She didn't look up. The rest of the week played out like variations on the same quiet script. Teachers nodded but didn't engage. Students kept their distance. Even when she answered questions correctly or finished her assignments early, she wasn't praised like the others. The sting wasn't just in being excluded. It was in being unseen. It was in being good and still being invisible. Each day when she came home, her mother would ask the same question, "How was school?" And each day, Aaliyah gave the same answer, "Fine." Then she'd go to her room. Sometimes she'd take out the photo she kept hidden in a sleeve inside her notebook. The one of her as a baby in the arms of a younger Dwayne Johnson, smiling down at her with a love no camera could fake. Sometimes she just stared at it. Other times she whispered to it like it could whisper back. On Thursday evening, Aaliyah sat in bed with her knees tucked to her chest while her mother folded laundry nearby. They didn't talk much, but Tasha watched her out of the corner of her eye. Aaliyah felt it, the weight of concern unspoken. She turned and asked quietly, "Why don't they see me?" Tasha stopped folding and walked over. She knelt in front of her daughter and placed her hands on Aaliyah's knees. "Baby, you shine too bright for people who only know how to squint. But don't let them shrink you to their size, not ever." Aaliyah nodded but didn't reply. She closed her eyes and tried to picture what tomorrow might feel like, just one day where someone would say her name right, where someone would hear her voice and actually listen. She didn't know it yet, but that moment was coming. And it would change everything. On Monday morning, Aaliyah walked into room 208 and found her usual spot by the window. The air felt warmer, not in temperature but in tension. Students buzzed with conversation about their weekends, soccer games, birthday parties, amusement park visits, things she was never part of. Mrs. Bishop stood at the front of the class, tapping a clipboard against her palm. When the class settled, she cleared her throat and announced something new. "This Friday will be our annual Career Hero Day. Each of you will prepare a short speech about someone in your family who inspires you. It could be a parent, grandparent, or guardian. You'll tell us who they are, what they do, and why they matter to you. You may include photos or props if you like." The room lit up with chatter. Students leaned toward each other excitedly. "My dad's a fire chief, my aunt's a surgeon, my mom's a lawyer." Aaliyah sat still but alert. Something stirred inside her that hadn't been there before. She already knew who she would talk about, not because he was famous, because he was hers. That evening, at home, Aaliyah quietly opened her closet and pulled down the worn shoebox she hadn't touched in months. Inside were pieces of a life most people didn't know existed. Old birthday cards with messages signed in bold handwriting. A letter written in blue ink that had faded slightly over the years. And, at the bottom, a photo. The photo. It was a candid shot. No stage lighting, no red carpet. Just a younger Dwayne Johnson sitting on a couch in a plain gray hoodie, holding a baby swaddled in a yellow blanket. His smile was soft and real. His hand rested gently on the baby's back. That baby was her. She touched the photo like it might disappear if she blinked too fast. Her mother had told her everything when she was 8. That Dwayne had once been part of their lives, before Hollywood, that he had loved them, that when fame came calling, He chose to protect them by staying private. No interviews, no headlines, no Instagram posts, just letters, calls, and the occasional visit when no one was looking. But the love, her mother said, had always been real. She carried the photo into the kitchen and placed it gently on the table. Her mother, still in her scrubs, looked up with tired eyes and nodded slowly. "You want to tell them?" Aaliyah said yes. Her voice didn't shake. Tasha pulled out a chair and sat beside her. She didn't speak right away. Then she said, "If you tell the truth, you have to be ready." Ready for what? For people not to believe it. For people to laugh. For people to say ugly things. But you also have to be ready to stand tall through all of it. That's what telling the truth costs sometimes. Aaliyah looked back at the photo. "He always told me to be proud of who I am." Tasha smiled gently and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then do what he taught you." All week, Aaliyah worked on her speech. She wrote and rewrote her words, practicing each line aloud in front of the mirror. Sometimes her voice wobbled, but she kept going. She imagined her classmates listening, seeing past the fame, seeing the truth. She imagined Mrs. Bishop smiling for once. She wrote, "My dad is Dwayne Johnson. But to me, he's just Dad. He's my hero because he taught me to stand tall even when the world tries to make me small." She added, "I know I don't look like him, but families come in all shapes, all colors. Truth isn't about what you expect. It's about what's real." Her mother watched from the hallway one night as Aaliyah stood at the mirror and repeated her lines. She didn't interrupt. She just listened with arms crossed and eyes full of something between pride and concern. On Thursday, during recess, Aaliyah stayed inside to review her note cards again. The classroom was mostly empty, except for a few kids passing through. That's when Madison and her friends entered. They glanced at her desk, where the photo was tucked halfway under her notebook. Madison sauntered over, voice full of syrupy sarcasm. "So, who's your hero, new girl?" "Let me guess. Beyoncé? Michelle Obama?" Aaliyah replied simply, "My dad, Dwayne Johnson." The pause was brief but deafening. Then came the laughter. Loud, sharp, cruel. Madison doubled over, clapping her hands. "You think The Rock is your dad? Girl, please, you look nothing like him." One of the other girls chimed in. "Maybe your mom just told you that to make you feel special." Madison leaned closer. "You're seriously going to stand up tomorrow and say that? In front of everyone?" Aaliyah didn't answer. She reached into her folder and pulled the photo out. Madison leaned in to see it and scoffed. That could be anyone. "My uncle looks like that from behind." Her friends laughed again as they walked off. Aaliyah stared at the photo. The image hadn't changed. But suddenly, it felt more like a fragile hope than a powerful truth. She tucked it back into the sleeve and closed her folder. For the first time all week, she doubted herself. Maybe it would have been easier to say someone else. Her mother, her aunt, anyone believable. But then she remembered the sound of his voice over the phone. The way he said, "Always speak your truth, even if they don't like the sound of it." And so she decided. Tomorrow, no matter what, she would speak. That night, she checked her backpack 3 times to make sure the photo was still there. She laid out her clothes carefully. She practiced once more in front of the mirror. "My name is Aaliyah Rivers. My hero is my dad, Dwayne Johnson." She closed her eyes and said it again, and again, until it didn't hurt to imagine being laughed at, until it sounded like armor. Tomorrow she would step into that classroom and she would speak the truth, no matter who tried to silence it. Friday morning arrived cloaked in overcast skies and a stillness that felt heavier than usual. Aaliyah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing down the collar of the blouse her mom had ironed the night before. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her face stayed calm. She had gone over the speech so many times she could recite it in her sleep. The photo of her and her father was tucked securely into the clear plastic sleeve of her folder. She checked her bag once, then twice, then a third time. Her mother stood in the hallway watching her silently, not with fear, but with fierce tenderness. Aaliyah met her eyes. Tasha simply nodded and said 3 words, "You got this." On the bus, the usual whisper of conversation lowered to a hush as Aaliyah stepped on. Someone near the front muttered "Hollywood faker" under their breath, just loud enough to carry. She kept her head high and walked to her usual seat at the back. Her fingers gripped her backpack tightly, but her gaze stayed steady. She stared out the window, letting the rhythm of passing streets calm her breathing. When she entered, room 208 Mrs. Bishop was already arranging the order of presenters. She glanced at Aaliyah briefly, then looked back at her clipboard. The air in the room was buzzing with energy. Posters leaned against desks, props peeked out from bags. Madison and her friends sat near the center, whispering and giggling, already turned halfway toward Aaliyah like they were waiting for a punchline. One by one, students walked to the front and shared their stories. A boy talked about his dad, who managed a construction crew. A girl showed photos of her mother in a nurse's uniform. Another student displayed her grandfather's military medals. Each time, the class clapped warmly. Mrs. Bishop smiled, nodded, asked questions. When Colin talked about his father coaching the high school football team, she practically beamed. She laughed at his jokes, clapped louder than the others. And then she called the next name, Aaliyah. The room quieted. A few students leaned forward. Aaliyah stood and walked slowly to the front of the room. Her heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her ears, but her hands didn't shake. She placed her folder and the photo on Mrs. Bishop's desk. She took a breath. "My name is Aaliyah Rivers," she said clearly, "and my hero is my dad, Dwayne Johnson. You might know him as The Rock, but to me, he's just my father." The laughter came instantly, harsh, loud, and unfiltered. A few students clapped sarcastically. Madison slapped the desk with an exaggerated gasp. "Oh my God, stop it. You're joking, right?" Colin leaned back grinning like it was the best entertainment he'd had all week. "You're kidding me. The Rock is your dad? Girl, come on, be serious." Someone from the back said, "Do you even know what your dad looks like?" Aaliyah paused, her mouth halfway open, unsure whether to push through or retreat. Mrs. Bishop raised a hand and the noise dimmed, but the smirks and side glances didn't go away. Her expression was unreadable, but her next words carried the weight of dismissal. "Aaliyah, let's not turn this into a fantasy exercise. Career Hero Day is meant to celebrate real people in your life, not someone you saw in a movie." A few more giggles rippled through the class. Aaliyah's voice faltered, but she tried again. "He is my dad. I have—" "That's enough," Mrs. Bishop interrupted sharply. "Please sit down." Her tone wasn't angry, but it was final, absolute. With every eye in the room watching, Aaliyah picked up her folder and photo and returned to her seat. Her face felt hot and tight. She didn't look at anyone. No one clapped. No one met her eyes. Not even the kids who had laughed the hardest. The damage was already done. She didn't hear the next 3 presentations. The voices blurred into a static hum around her. She sat still in her chair, holding the photo inside the folder like it might shatter if she moved too fast. When the bell rang, she didn't move until most of the room had emptied. As she walked out, Madison passed by and whispered just loud enough to be heard, "Maybe next time, pick someone more believable. Aaliyah didn't respond. She didn't even flinch, but her fingers pressed deeper into the plastic edge of the photo as if to remind herself that it was still real, that it still mattered. She skipped lunch and went straight to the library. She found a cornered table in the back behind a shelf of biographies and opened her notebook but didn't write anything. She placed the photo in front of her on the table and stared at it. For the first time, it felt like she wasn't looking at her father, but at a stranger no one else in the world believed. Her throat felt tight, her stomach hollow. She didn't cry. She didn't let herself. But something inside her curled in on itself like paper caught in a slow flame. The words she had practiced now felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone braver, someone louder, someone who didn't care about being mocked. The final bell rang. Aaliyah walked home in silence. Cars passed, birds chirped. None of it touched her. At home, her mother was in the kitchen chopping vegetables. Music played softly from a phone on the counter. Tasha turned when Aaliyah entered and immediately saw her daughter's face. Aaliyah didn't speak. She walked to the table, placed the wrinkled speech and the folded photo down in front of her mother, and then left the room. Upstairs, she lay on her bedshoes, still on eyes staring at the ceiling. She didn't want to talk. She didn't want to explain. Her truth had been laughed at, crushed, and tossed aside by the very person who was supposed to protect it. Downstairs, Tasha sat at the table reading the speech. Her hands trembled only once. When she reached the last line, she looked up and stared through the window at the fading light. She picked up the photo, studied it for a long moment, and then reached for her phone. Her fingers hesitated over the screen before she tapped a name she hadn't touched in years. It rang twice. Then a voice answered. "Hello?" She breathed in. "Dwayne, it's Tasha." A pause. Then he asked quietly, "Is she okay?" "No, Tasha," said her voice low and steady. They laughed at her. Her teacher shut her down. All because she told the truth. The silence on the line deepened. Then he said, "I'll be there tomorrow. Tell her she did the right thing. Tell her I said that." "I will," Tasha said. Then she ended the call and picked up the photo again. Her thumb brushed the edge of her daughter's baby face in Dwayne's arms. She sat in silence for a long time. Upstairs, Aaliyah closed her eyes and told herself over and over, "I told the truth. I told the truth." But even truths can break when no one believes them. Monday morning arrived with a sky so still it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Aaliyah walked into Brookside Middle without a word to anyone, her steps light but certain, as if the weight of Friday had passed through her and left only hollow space behind. Students in the hall didn't laugh anymore. They didn't speak either. The silence around her had changed. It was no longer about exclusion, but about discomfort, as though the shame of watching someone be humiliated had rippled beneath the surface and left everyone afraid to look her in the eye. In room 208, Mrs. Bishop was already at her desk. Her face, as always, was unreadable, her voice calm, her tone detached. She said nothing about what had happened. She didn't acknowledge Aaliyah at all. She passed out a worksheet on adverbs and began her lesson as though Friday had never happened. But Aaliyah knew better. The silence now wasn't neutral. It was avoidance, a refusal to confront what had been exposed in plain sight. At 9:17 a.m., there was a knock at the classroom door. It was not loud, but firm. The room froze. Mrs. Bishop paused mid-sentence and turned, surprised. She walked to the door and opened it slowly. Standing there was a tall man in a dark gray hoodie and jeans. His head was slightly bowed, but his presence filled the doorway like a boulder had rolled into a stream. Gasps spread through the room like electricity. Eyes widened, mouths dropped open. It was him. Dwayne Johnson. The Rock. He didn't smile. He didn't speak right away. He looked across the room until his eyes found Aaliyah sitting by the window, her folder pressed to her chest, her lips parted in disbelief. He nodded at her gently. Then he stepped into the classroom. Mrs. Bishop blinked rapidly as she stepped aside. "Mr. Johnson," she stammered, I wasn't—" He raised a hand calmly. "It's okay," he said. "I imagine you weren't expecting me." She nodded awkwardly, not meeting his eyes. He turned to face the class. "I believe there's been some confusion," he said, his voice calm but resonant like a slow-moving storm. "Aaliyah told you the truth, and you didn't believe her. Not because she lied, but because the truth didn't fit your idea of what a daughter of someone like me should look like." His eyes turned back to Mrs. Bishop. "You doubted her because of her skin, because in your mind, someone who looks like Aaliyah couldn't possibly be my child. You dismissed her story before you heard it. That's not education. That's prejudice." Mrs. Bishop opened her mouth. She looked as though she might speak, but no words came. Her lips trembled. Her fingers clutched the edge of her desk. Then, slowly, she looked down. Dwayne looked back at the students. His face remained calm, but his eyes had hardened. "You all laughed," he said, "because you thought the idea of someone like her having a father like me was a joke. Some of you thought she was trying to get attention, but she wasn't. She was telling her truth. And she was braver than any of you who chose to mock her." He turned to Aaliyah now. "You didn't do anything wrong. You were honest. And that takes strength. Strength most adults don't even have." His words filled the room and silenced even the chairs as no one dared to shift. Aaliyah stood slowly, her knees shaking, but her hands steady. She walked to the front of the room and stood beside her father. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I didn't say he was my dad for attention. I said it because it's true. But no one believed me. Because I don't look like what you expected, and because you didn't think someone like me deserved someone like him." She turned to Mrs. Bishop. "You didn't just call me a liar. You made my truth small. You made me feel like I was nothing." Mrs. Bishop finally looked up. Her face was pale and her voice cracked. "Aaliyah, She stopped. Then quietly she said I was wrong. I should have listened. I let my assumptions get in the way. I'm sorry." Aaliyah didn't answer. She didn't need to. The words had been said. The silence that followed was not awkward this time. It was necessary. It was the kind of silence that carried weight and demanded space. Dwayne turned back to the class. Families don't all look the same. Truth doesn't need to wear a certain face. Love doesn't come in one color. I've spent a lot of my life playing heroes on screen, but let me tell you who the real hero is. It's her. He placed a hand on Aaliyah's shoulder and squeezed it gently. This young woman stood up in front of all of you and told her truth, knowing she might be laughed at. That's not weakness. That's courage. Mrs. Bishop stepped aside slowly. Her usual confident posture had wilted. She returned to her desk quietly. Aaliyah and her father stood at the front of the room for another moment. No one moved. Then one hand rose in the back of the room. Olivia, the quiet girl with glasses. She stood slowly and said, "I laughed. I didn't mean to, but I did. And I'm sorry." Madison shifted in her seat, her mouth pressed tight. A boy next to her looked down at his desk. The temperature in the room had changed. Not just because Dwayne Johnson stood there, but because something inside each student had shifted. The way they saw Aaliyah, the way they saw truth, the way they saw themselves. The bell rang, but no one moved. Dwayne leaned down to Aaliyah and whispered, "Let's get out of here." She nodded and they walked out together. The hallway parted for them like a river. Some students stepped aside. Others watched with wide eyes. No one spoke. Outside the school, Tasha waited by the car. She stepped forward when she saw them and Dwayne opened his arms. They embraced briefly. Then Tasha turned to Aaliyah. "You okay?" Aaliyah nodded. "Better than I was." Tasha looked at Dwayne. "Thank you for coming." He shook his head. "I should have come sooner." That afternoon, the principal requested a meeting. Mrs. Bishop sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her usual authority had slipped away. Tasha sat next to Aaliyah, her presence calm but firm. Dwayne sat on the other side, his expression unreadable. The principal tried to explain the incident as a misunderstanding. Mrs. Bishop interrupted him quietly. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an assumption, a harmful one. I didn't believe her, and I humiliated her. I'm truly sorry. Tasha nodded, but her voice was steel. You owe her more than words. The principal agreed. It was decided that Mrs. Bishop would deliver a public apology during Monday's assembly. That evening, Aaliyah sat at the kitchen table helping her mom fold laundry. Dwayne sat on the couch watching her with quiet pride. They didn't talk about the classroom. They didn't talk about the photo. They talked about music, about favorite foods, about how weird it was when people asked for autographs at gas stations. When Aaliyah asked why he never went public about her before he answered honestly. I thought I was protecting you. I didn't want you caught in all the noise, but maybe I was just protecting myself. Aaliyah nodded. I don't need the world to know. I just needed someone to believe me. Dwayne smiled. And now they do. The auditorium buzzed with low conversation as students filed into rows and teachers found seats along the side walls. Monday's assembly was usually reserved for reminders and announcements, but this time there was something heavier in the air, something unspoken that hovered in every corner of the room. Aaliyah sat in the front row next to her mother, who wore her scrubs under a light jacket, her face unreadable but calm. Dwayne Johnson sat on Aaliyah's other side, dressed plainly, his posture relaxed but his presence undeniable. He wasn't here as a celebrity today. He was here as a father. On the stage, the microphone waited under a spotlight that made the room seem darker than it was. When the principal stepped forward, the noise fell away like water draining from a sink. His voice was formal. Today, a member of our staff has something important to say. Please listen with respect. Mrs. Bishop walked slowly onto the stage holding a single sheet of paper. She didn't wear her usual tight smile. Her shoulders were squared, but her gaze was lowered. She stopped at the mic, adjusted it slightly, and looked up at the crowd of middle schoolers. Her voice was quiet but steady. Last week I made a mistake, a serious mistake. I doubted a student's story because of my own assumptions. I let my expectations get in the way of truth. And in doing so, I hurt someone who trusted me. Her voice caught for a second, but she didn't stop. When Aaliyah Rivers stood in front of our class and told us who her father was, I didn't listen. I didn't believe her. And my disbelief wasn't just skepticism, it was prejudice. It was a failure to see her for who she truly is. I am deeply sorry. She looked down at Aaliyah. I hope you can forgive me, and I hope every student here learns from this moment. We have to do better. I have to do better. All of us do. The room remained silent for a heartbeat, then another, Then soft applause began somewhere near the back. It spread slowly, rippling forward until even the teachers along the walls were clapping. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't performative. It was acknowledgement. And when Aaliyah looked around, she saw something in the faces of her classmates that hadn't been there before. Recognition, not of fame, not of celebrity, but of truth. The truth she had stood for. The truth she had carried when no one else did. After the assembly, Aaliyah walked through the halls and felt the difference like a shift in gravity. Madison didn't laugh as she passed. Olivia gave a small wave. A few kids even said hi. She wasn't suddenly popular. She didn't become the center of attention, but she wasn't invisible anymore. In class, Mrs. Bishop didn't avoid her gaze. She called on her by name. She smiled when Aaliyah shared an answer, and one afternoon she pulled her aside. "I'm working on a new project for the class about identity, about family. I was wondering if you'd help me with it." Aaliyah hesitated for a moment. Then she said okay. Not because she needed validation, but because she had learned that sometimes change starts with one small voice daring to speak. The project became a month-long unit called Truth Tellers. Students shared stories about their parents, their grandparents, their caretakers. Some were messy, some were complicated, but every story mattered. And when it came time to present, Aaliyah stood at the front of the room again. This time, she wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. She spoke her truth, and the room listened, really listened. Later that month, Brookside hosted a community night. Families came together in the gym for food posters and presentations. Tables were set up with family trees, drawings, and essays. Aaliyah stood with her mother answering questions about her project when the gym doors opened and people turned. Dwayne Johnson entered quietly, dressed in jeans and a baseball cap. He didn't make a scene. He didn't draw attention. He greeted people politely, shook hands, signed a few papers for parents who couldn't resist, and then walked over to Aaliyah. "Proud of you," he said. She smiled and leaned into his side. Her mother joined them, and for a moment the three of them stood together in a simple triangle of love and truth that didn't need anyone's approval. That night in her bedroom, Aaliyah lay beneath the covers staring at the ceiling. The photo still sat inside her notebook, not hidden anymore, not protected out of fear, just there. A reminder. She whispered into the dark, not to anyone in particular, not for anyone to hear. "I'm not just his daughter. I'm me, and that's enough." And it was, because the world had tried to shrink her, to laugh her into silence. But she stood tall. She told her truth, and the world had listened, not because she shouted, but because the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs someone brave enough to say it out loud.